Thanks, folks, for being here. I just wanted to give a teeny little background. A group of colleagues and I who were on the call to Carmen Ugarte, Martin Bohn, and Alice Formiga with some others who couldn't make it, Brian Andres, and I think Walter Goldstein is in another session, and Juan Andrade, other colleagues, did a project on participatory breeding with corn-based cropping systems, and through that we were looking at traits that we thought were of tremendous value, but some of the hurdles that are barriers to successful participatory breeding networks were of interest to us, and we were looking at some of the larger social wants that people are interested in, and we were interested in kind of how those traits that tie to societal value get developed within systems-based breeding networks. And so we invited colleagues to speak with us today on a panel and be available for questions to get at this, because we think there's some wonderful cross-pollination to be gained from engaging these folks. So our first presentation is going to be a recorded presentation by Ben Schrager, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Utsunomiya University in Japan, and I'm sure I slaughtered that. And so for our first session, if that recorded presentation could be shown, then that will be followed by brief presentations by Sara, Nawaz, and Susanna Klassen, where Sara is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oxford at the University of British Columbia, and Susanna is a PhD candidate and a public scholar, Lou Scholar at the Institute for Resources and Environmental Sustainability at the University of British Columbia as well. And then we'll hear finally from Edith Lammerts van Bueren, who is a senior researcher at the Louis Bolk Institute and a special professor of organic breeding at Wageningen. And she is also a co-founder and chair of the European Consortium for Organic Plant Breeding, and now leads the Bio Academy and Dutch Platform for Education for Organic Agriculture. So we're very much looking forward to hearing from them.
Okay, would you like me to start the video?
Please.
So my name is Benjamin Schrager, and the name of my talk today is the use of marker-assisted selection for seed corn in Hawaii and some implications for organic crop breeders. A bit about me. I got my BA from Grinnell College in Iowa, and that's where I first became interested in corn. And then I got my MA and PhD in geography at University of Hawaii at Manoa. So when I got to Hawaii, I was kind of surprised to learn that the biggest agricultural industry in the state was seed corn. Not what I was expecting to find. And so my main research is on chicken meat industries in Japan. And I've recently started as an assistant professor at Utsunomiya University in Japan, which is a bit north of Tokyo. So my MA research, as I mentioned, focused on the seed corn industry. And I was very excited to hear about this panel from Dr. Michelle Wander, who invited me to join and organize the other panelists. And I hear that there's been recent discussions about marker-assisted selection, so this makes my research on its use in Hawaii relevant. So what I'd like to do today is first introduce the seed corn industry in Hawaii, then explain the use of MASS. I'm going to use that abbreviation throughout for marker-assisted selection for seed corn in Hawaii. And then from there, kind of think about some implications for organic and participatory breeding. And I wrote about this in a paper with my advisor, Chris Navati Suryanata, that we published in Journal of Agrarian Change. Okay, so jumping right into Hawaii's seed corn industry. It started in the late 1960s as a winter nursery. So what winter nursery at that time meant is if you're doing seed corn improvement in, say, the Corn Belt, Iowa, and you have a line you want to improve quicker, you can send it to a warmer place like Hawaii over the winter. It gets an additional generation of growth and it can be grown quicker. But in general, this was a pretty small industry. And it's not until we start to see consolidations by seed corporations and big increases in their R&D expenditures that kind of the seed corn industry in Hawaii transitions from a small winter nursery to kind of a big year-round nursery. And what happened is kind of like with the introduction of GM traits of Roundup Ready and BT, those were kind of the first big traits. Seed companies, corporations spent a lot of money and there was rapid consolidation, rapid increases in R&D. And there's a stat that is thrown around a lot in the industry, this quote, which is 90% of seed corn passes through Hawaii. And it's not exactly clear, like at what point does corn gain its Hawaii connection when it's just being improved, but especially for the top lines that they're in a hurry to improve, a lot of research happens in Hawaii or other places with suitable climates. So the main activity is seed corn improvement, which relies heavily on marker-assisted selection, but there's also seed corn increase, and observational nurseries are kind of like the smaller parts of the industry in Hawaii. So it takes just over 7 generations to develop a new line using conventional methods for seed corn. So you can think that with winter nurseries, okay, that means you can get 2 growth cycles in a year, so it would take 3.5 years. With year-round in Hawaii, then you could do more than 3 it's like 3 generations or maybe even a little bit quicker than that in a year. But the drawback of this kind of investment is that it costs more money. And also, when you're growing corn in Hawaii, you cannot make observations based on the type of environment that it's going to encounter in, say, the Midwest, because the climate is different, the pests are going to be different. So in my dissertation, I tried to come up with a few just basic figures of corn breeding. Some of you will be very familiar with this. Others of you, it'll be maybe too detailed, but the gist of it is that, yeah, stuff improves slowly. It takes like 7 generations to create, to introgress a new trait. If you're trying to create a new line, it takes like 8 generations before you can even test this new hybrid corn. So thinking about the use of marker-assisted selection, what this enables is kind of a break from traditional seed crop improvement. So traditional seed crop improvement relies on in situ phenotypic evaluations. In other words, you have to see how the crop grows in order to evaluate whether or not it's doing well. On the other hand, mass enables crop breeders to make ex situ genotypic evaluations through DNA analysis. And over 10 years ago, there was already a corn chipper technology, which meant that seed corporations could test DNA before even planting. And so only the seed that was met the type of genetic markers that they were looking for would be planted. And so genotypic evaluation more than doubles the rate of improvement for some tasks. So you could think of Now, 1 year of mass improvement in Hawaii would be like more than 7 generations of conventional improvement in the Corn Belt, where you can only do 1 generation per year. So one of the things that me and Krishna wrote about in our paper was the difference between the formal and real subsumption of nature. So it's basically like how do people profit from controlling nature? Well, these scholars, Boyd and a few others, they distinguish between formal, which is kind of like you make money by having ownership schemes, so consolidated control. We can think of seed corporations as having this, not monopoly, but oligopoly, this type of ownership scheme that enables them to profit. But there's also real subsumption of nature, which is where nature itself becomes more productive. So maybe the seeds yield more, they are able to resist disease better, but there are ways that nature itself is working harder. And so most of the strategies for profiting from nature are this kind of formal way of exerting ownership control, but seed corporations are unique because they're going after both formal and real subsumption of nature. So kind of pivoting now I'll return to that in a bit, but I want to talk a little bit about the trajectory of the seed corn industry in Hawaii. So it kind of like started off in 1990. You can see it's a very small part of the overall share of the industry, but then of overall sales, and then by like 2000s, it's increased very rapidly, and this is kind of around the time I was doing my research, and there was a lot of optimism that it would continue to go up, but since then it's declined. And one of the confusing things about evaluating this trajectory is that none of these seed corns are sold directly. They're all proprietary material owned by seed corporations. So this value is estimated operating expense. And so that is kind of tricky to figure out actually how big it is. But in terms of acreage, when I was conducting research, people estimated about 25,000 acres were used by seed corporations, only a small fraction of which was actively cultivated at one time. So some reasons for the industry's decline. This image that's been in the background, I highlighted a few plots from Oahu that are owned by Pioneer. And you can see that it's right next to a residential area. So a few reasons that it's right next to a residential area, and it's right next to really famous surf on the North Shore. So this is close to Haleiwa. It's faced opposition because it occupies a lot of prime agricultural land. Local residents criticize it for releasing pesticides and GMOs, and it's also faced criticism and national and even international mobilization based on its larger role in the political economy of food. So for example, Vandana Shiva visited Hawaii several times as a part of opposition to the seed corn industry there. So as Hawaii became less favorable, the industry kind of shifted to places with more favorable political conditions. So Puerto Rico, Chile, Brazil are a few places where I've heard of there being seed corn industries. And the transparency and consistency with disclosing how big the industry is isn't really there. So it's hard to figure out exactly where it's moving or if it's overall decreasing or increasing. And new crop breeding technologies may reduce the need for year-round nurseries. So things like mass. At the time I was doing my research, there was a technique called doubled haploid production. I think that's no longer in favor, but gene editing definitely is. So thinking about transitioning now to think about what mass means for organic and participatory crop breeding. Most certified organic seed corn is produced by large corporations like Bayer, Monsanto, DeKalb. They use mass to improve seed corn and also to ensure against contamination from GM traits. So mass is a tool for genetic analysis, not modification. So in that way, as like a more precise tool for crop improvement, mass is consistent with organic certification. However, I think that part of the issues that we see associated with mass, they're kind of connected to broader issues of consolidation of seed in the US and around the world in a handful of large corporations. So since hybrid corn, companies and corporations have been generating profit based on indigenous crops and also crops that were developed through public land grant universities often. So we start to see this kind of unfair way of capitalizing on what were once kind of publicly owned goods. And long-standing mass programs equip corporations with crop breeding advantages that continue to grow. Now there may be limits to this, like because something like yield, there are many different factors that go into it, but it still does appear as though the advantages that seed corporations have, they're able to just keep on building on them, and it makes it very difficult for space to emerge for alternative producers. So I see the problem here as not being inherent to the technology of mass, but from this broader political economy of seed crops. And if we think about formal and real subsumption of nature, corporations, seed corporations, exploit both, and it's problematic. So thinking about mass and participatory breeding, beyond a narrow definition of organic certification, how might mass fit with the tenets of participatory breeding? To what extent are new technologies consistent with broader goals of agroecological and sustainable farming? I know this is organic seed conference, but I mean, so much of what I've seen, it's not just about specifically meeting organic certification, but also these broader commitments to alternative agriculture. So new technologies create potential for intensification, but it's still important to support better seeds, right? So things like yield, nutrition, disease resistance, drought resistance, taste. And I think that mass is an increasingly important tool, and alternative food systems really need a base in alternative agricultural inputs like seeds. So it's going to be difficult to avoid this technology entirely. And there have been a few articles in Journal of Peasant Studies that kind of look at seed activism or repurposing the master's tools that for me are helpful to think about this, but I'm not entirely clear about the practical application. So I'm eager to discuss this more. And as I mentioned, mass does seem to be increasingly influential. I don't think the technology is inherently bad, but it reinforces the growing centralization of corporate power over seeds. And I do think that there is potential for utilizing mass within participatory crop breeding, and also on a related note, we can think about how might we build connections to winter and year-round nurseries. Seeing some of the issues that arise in Hawaii makes me very attuned to that issue. So I'll stop there. Thanks for your time, and look forward to the discussion.
Sarah's sharing and I'm kicking us off. Great, so I assume we can go ahead with ours now. So hi everyone, my name is Susanna Klassen, and my colleague Sara and I are very pleased to be presenting to you alongside these other great panelists on the topic of re-articulating organic plant breeding in the age of gene editing. Before we begin, I'd like to first acknowledge that this research was conducted out of the University of British Columbia, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And we are very grateful to have been able to learn from and on these lands while conducting this research. And I'd also like to acknowledge our fantastic co-author, Dr. Alex Lyon, who works on participatory plant breeding in organic agriculture and is an instructor in the Sustainable Agriculture program at Kwantlen Polytechnic University. And Alex was unable to be part of this presentation, but was a co-author on the research being presented. So just to introduce myself a little bit further, I'm currently a PhD candidate, as Michelle already mentioned, at the University of British Columbia. And my doctoral research focuses on organic certification and standards, on sustainability, which is in my definition very inclusive of justice and equity, and on farm labor in Canadian agriculture.
Thanks, Susanna. And I'll jump in. I'm Sara, and I recently completed my PhD at the same department as Susanna at UBC. And I'm now, and that topic, the topic of my dissertation was looking at social aspects of gene editing in agriculture. And my current position is I'm a postdoc at Oxford University, still affiliated with UBC, and now looking at questions of social aspects of carbon dioxide removal technologies. So getting to the topic of our presentation, gene editing and other genomic-based technologies have gained a lot of attention and even hype in recent years. And gene editing is in particular taken off following the invention of CRISPR-Cas9 tools about a decade ago. And proponents have been making a lot of claims about gene editing, which have included claims that gene editing is fundamentally quite different from GM. They have argued that it is safer or less risky than GM. They've also claimed that these technologies are cheaper and thus more accessible and inherently more democratic than GM. And they've also argued that gene editing might be sort of an essential means to address particular breeding challenges, such as those being exacerbated by climate change. And Susanna and Alex and I kind of came to this with curiosity about exploring how the organic sector was responding to this hype around gene editing. And we were particularly curious about the organic sector specifically because it has historically been such a stronghold of resistance to GM. And we wanted to know, it seems like proponents would like people to think about gene editing as something quite different than GM, but do people in the sector actually agree with this? So we wanted to also understand what our findings might tell us about broader challenges that are facing the organic sector, as well as what kind of insights might be useful for governing other breeding methods and technologies in the sector in the future. Not sure if this bar is distracting. It just moved over here, but hopefully it's okay. And just a last point, we thought that these questions would be an opportunity to sort of explore tensions at the intersection of science, technology, ownership, control, and agroecological futures. So before continuing further, I also wanted to briefly review how gene editing relates to other forms of altering or modifying genes. So I've been mentioning GM. This usually refers to, of course, the use of recombinant DNA technology to introduce new genetic material, usually from an unrelated species, into another organism's genome. And gene editing is like GM in that it also involves making cuts to an organism's DNA, but here the cuts are, at least in theory, at more targeted locations. And a last point is that while some examples of gene editing involve the insertion of new genetic material, they don't necessarily do so. They also might, for example, just include short deletions. So to explore these questions, we employed a multi-method approach combining interviews, participant observation at conferences, and a review of publicly available literature that we found online. And our sample was individuals and organizations in both the US and Canada involved in the organic sector via standard setting activities, convening, research, or advocacy.
Great, so I'm just gonna lead us through a quick summary of a few of our key findings that are relevant to this discussion. So first and foremost, many of you probably know that gene editing is not allowed in organic certified production in either jurisdiction, in Canada or the US. And the arguments that we heard from participants in interviews and through participant observation, they really echoed many of the key concerns about GM crops, importantly. So we've highlighted a few key ones here. The first being a reproduction of an inherently flawed political economic system. A second being that these technologies aren't really addressing the problems that are at the root of inequity or unsustainability in the food system. And the third is remaining concerns around enforceability and traceability of these technologies. So this is to say that participants really didn't feel like gene editing technologies were overcoming issues of democratic control, accessibility, or reduced risk, and they don't feel that technologies address real food systems problems. And just to illustrate a few of these responses, this is a quote from a participant. The distinctions between the technologies become less important as you begin to look at the economic and social and cultural impacts. This is, an expansion of the industrial approach to food production. And another participant put it quite simply and eloquently that these technologies are really a solution in search of a problem. So really highlighting the fact that they're not offering something that are solving problems that really urgently need to be solved, like inequities, like food insecurity, and the damage caused by industrial agriculture. So we did find that some participants, and notably several plant breeders who work in organic, did express an appreciation of the science behind gene editing, as well as some curiosity about how it could be harnessed to create improvements that would be relevant for and impactful to the organic sector, like improving pest resistance. Yet, there was, across all participants, a lot of respect expressed for the decision to foreclose on the possible advances that could be made by allowing gene editing, not only for the reasons of opposition mentioned in the previous slide, but also just because of the huge trade-off in allowing it as a result of the pressure from consumers and just the risks and uncertainty, whether perceived or real, especially by consumers, and the need to provide certainty for consumers. And we wanted to also further underscore the diversity of reasons for opposition among participants that we spoke with. So one rationale where we saw a fair bit of disagreement was the rationale around the line of the integrity of plants, or the cell wall, really being the place where the sector should draw a line with breeding interventions. And so while several participants identified that this was an important reason for opposing gene editing technologies, a few participants also expressed discomfort with that, saying, one participant said, "As a scientist, I'm not totally comfortable with that, but I guess the way I rationalize it is that this is what the organic community sees as important, and that's the system I'm going to work within." Also, some expressed discomfort with what they perceive to be consumers' purity-based rationales, where they seek food that is clean or pure. And then just finally, these divergent rationales really underscored for us what several participants brought up, which is the need for open dialogue and debate within the organic community, and the importance of venues like this conference and the Organic BC conference for facilitating community conversations, especially where these differences of opinions exist.
Yeah, and our last set of findings also really centered not just around gene editing, but also actually other breeding methods. So we found that scrutiny of gene editing has open discussions on the use of a lot of other types of breeding methods for the sector, which included both marker-assisted breeding or marker-assisted selection, as Ben was discussing, as well as the acceptability of older breeding methods, which include things like irradiation-induced mutagenesis and cell fusion, which have been used to develop important organic crops. And so we found from participants that regulatory bodies are really having to clarify whether these older breeding methods are acceptable or not. And several participants that we spoke with explained concerns around if certain methods were to be deemed excluded, that it would pose a challenge for sourcing for growers.
So there's certainly pressure on the organic sector to draw clear boundaries between what is acceptable and what is excluded. And this is driven, at least in part, by the need to continue being a trusted alternative to other forms of agriculture, where much of its legitimacy is conferred through certification, which relies heavily on standards. So in my PhD research, we found that the standards actually say very little about what types of approaches to breeding should be promoted, what the goals are, and what the ideal treatment of genetic material for certified organic production should be, beyond the sourcing of organic seed and what breeding methods are excluded. So to present a true alternative while still taking advantage of technological tools like marker-assisted selection, organic really needs to be a leader in advancing a more democratic, accessible, and publicly controlled approach to breeding. And I think certainly these approaches are being advanced, especially in spaces like this conference again, and in other sessions happening concurrently with this one. Oh, sorry, Sarah, over to you.
Sorry, cut you off there a bit, Sus. Something else that we noticed was that naturalness as an idea showed up both implicitly and explicitly as a criterion for drawing these lines and determining whether different methods are allowable or not. So for example, the NOP definition of excluded methods is those that are not possible under natural conditions. And I want to point out that this is absolutely not an issue restricted to the organic sector. I think it's coming up across in other jurisdictions and contexts. So an example of this is the EU's definition of modified organisms for their biosafety regulations, as those organisms in which genetic material has been altered in a way that does not occur naturally. And I think a last point here is that what natural means in terms of breeding methods is, we would argue, very subject to interpretation and doesn't really lend itself to create clear or crisp delineations, which is having implications for the sector. And kind of building on this, we found that regulatory bodies in both the US and Canada are under a lot of pressure to kind of keep up with the specifics of different technologies. And what we found that kind of meant is that they're having to spend a lot of effort working to try to articulate what organic is not versus what it is, which kind of can be seen as having a bit of a narrowing effect on the sector's ability to focus on the broader values that it stands for. And we also found that these tasks of deliberating over what's in and out end up being quite time consuming and also very hard for many people in the sector beyond key decision makers to take part in. Going back to what I mentioned earlier about proponent claims that gene editing is a democratizing or inherently more inclusive technology, we really found evidence to the contrary, which is quite in line with what Maiwa Montenegro has argued, that access to a technology such as gene editing is really quite different from the capacity to utilize it for one's own purposes.
So just a few concluding thoughts. In essence, we really found and feel that the current regulatory paradigm for thinking about gene editing and other possibly excluded methods for organic agriculture defaults to what we would call a technocentric approach. And just thinking about the question and really presenting this to all of you is how can the organic sector move past this orientation? And we suggest and really agree with this approach of a systems breeding approach as articulated by others, that this could really help shift the focus away from the red herring technological specifics, like what forms of intervention and human tinkering are acceptable or not. And we really point towards Edith Lammerts van Buren's fantastic paper with colleagues that really helps provide a framework and a vocabulary for that to elucidate the diversity of approaches and help us arrive at a common understanding for what they accomplish or not, and just giving vocabulary and conceptual definition to the diversity of pathways available to the sector. And as well, we think this could help better explore how different breeding methods or particular applications achieve different sustainability goals or not. And just finally, we think the organic community can and is championing breeding methods that are accessible, democratic, and publicly controlled, and that this is really an opportunity to advance a true alternative to what is considered conventional breeding. And we'd just like to say thanks to everyone, thanks to our co-author who isn't here, thanks to our funding sources, and to those who organized the panel.
Great. I will share Edith's presentation, and we can Edith, I think you can jump in there if you're...
Yes, okay, thanks so much. And thanks to the previous speakers to give some valuable inputs. Yes, although I am officially retired, I am still active in the sector, in the organic sector, and are finalizing my last, I'm finalizing my last PhDs. And one of them is Michaela Colai from the Organic Seed Alliance. So my ties with the US are still quite tight. And I want to, before I want to move on to the systems-based breeding concept, which was announced by Sara and Susanna, I want to give some input for the discussion on the techniques. Can you pass on the next slide, Michelle? Michelle, can you turn, yeah, the next slide. What we notice is an ongoing discussion on whether the organic sector should be involved in the novel breeding techniques such as CRISPR-Cas and other gene editing techniques. And often people don't understand why we, if I say we, I mean the organic sector refrains from such techniques, saying, but we want the same, we all want sustainability. But it sometimes helps, I have noticed in the discussion, to distinguish different basic attitudes for the man-nature relationship, because that can help to understand why groups are very much in favor and other groups are not in favor of those novel breeding techniques. We have the attitude of the ruler that says the earth is being given to mankind and can use it as inputs for our food. And stewards say, yes, we agree, but we need to be careful to use nature in such a way that also the next generation can profit from it. And then the partner and the participant, I said partnership there, I mean participant. The partner and participant attitude goes a step further and says it's not only about the extrinsic, the usefulness of the plants and other elements in nature. We also value the intrinsic value of plants, in our case of plant breeding, which means acknowledging the dignity and the value of its own. And that is quite a distinction, because that notion of an intrinsic value of a plant is not a reality for the ruler or the steward, where it's only about the usefulness, the efficiency, and not the value and the dignity of plants for its own sake. And next slide. So that means that departing from a partner or a participant attitude towards nature, that will include also the acknowledgement of the intrinsic values, and that includes the integrity of plants or of ecosystems in our decision making on actions. Next slide. And I published a paper earlier in Crop Science in 2003, where we operationalized the concept of the integrity of life and distinguished 4 different levels. So you can use that to assess techniques. There is that general level of living organisms where you don't want to affect the autonomy and more or less self-ordering capacity of plants. And then you have the specific plant levels, the ability to adapt to and interact with its environment. You don't want to affect that, rather support it. The genotypic level is that you don't want to cross reproductive barriers. And the phenotypic level is that acknowledges that there is a balanced crop performance in crop and in seed production that you want to respect. Yes, next one. But it's not the first time that we are refraining from inputs. We have done that already for a long time ago, refraining from mineral fertilizers, because we wanted to build up a living soil and soil fertility. And it meant we had to learn to deal with compost in a modern way, to analyze it and to see what different composting methods there are and sources, cow manure, sheep, goat, or completely vegetative material. And we also reframed from herbicides and pesticides because we wanted to build up the agroecological resilience, and that meant we had to learn to enhance and manage biodiversity. And now we're in that phase of refraining from genetic engineering, DNA-based techniques, but still, of course, we want to build up plant robustness and food quality. So that means a challenge to breed for adaptive and flexible and nutritious varieties. So reframing from one technique doesn't mean that we stay with the old knowledge. We have to gain new knowledge to move forward, because, of course, also organic farmers need new varieties adapted to climate change, for instance, and other societal requests. Yes, the next slide. But we see that the discussion, and you could see that also in the previous presentations, we can distinguish actually three types of concerns in the discussion about techniques. The first one is about environmental and health risks. And as we see that those new techniques are developing and are becoming more and more precise, you can argue, yeah, the risks are smaller than maybe 10, 20 years ago. But then you still have to deal with the difference between a risk analysis and the appreciation of that outcome. For some, only a minor risk is still a too big risk to take, and rather look for alternatives. But we see that although the regulations, certainly in Europe, are only based on the environmental and health risks, you see that the public discussion is more and more on the socioeconomic and the legal consequences. The patenting, the merging to large multinationals, regulating what a consumer food package is going to look like. And the other third category of concern is about the respect for the values of organic agriculture. And I think that I already said in the arguments of the category one, you can argue, yes, but science is developing, risks are diminishing. I won't say that they're not there, but also the socioeconomic and legal consequences, you can argue, is that typically for the biotech industry, or is that typical for all the large multinational industries? The category that holds the most is actually the respect for the values of organic agriculture, because that is the choice of the organic sector itself, and that's where they can deal with. Yes, next one. And those values are have been collected in a democratic process of 2 years by IFOAM, which is the International Federation of Organic Agricultural Movements. And out of that 2-year worldwide democratic process, out of these outcomes, those 4 principles have appeared as covering the values of the organic sector: the principle of health, principle of ecology, the principle of fairness, where we have the socioeconomic aspects in there, and the principle of care. Yes? But nevertheless, we see that plant breeding or the organic farmers are still largely dependent on what the conventional breeding sector produces. And we see that with those novel breeding techniques, the focus is very much on individual traits, simplifying the complex reality, because the focus is mainly on major effects, where we have a lot of qualitative traits that are based on a lot more genes and are much more complex. like drought resistance, nitrogen efficiency, for instance, or root formation. So even the literature more and more speaks of trait breeding and no longer of plant breeding. That made me wonder, okay, but what about systems breeding? Because in the end, those varieties need to fit in a system, in the complexity, to serve not only the ecological resilience, but also the societal resilience. Yes, next one. So at a certain point, we analyzed if we really want to strive for both ecological resilience and societal resilience, where are we at this moment in the breeding sector? And across those quadrants, we could define 4 paradigm positions: breeding orientations, community-based breeding, which is very much like participatory breeding, ecosystem-based breeding, and trait-based breeding, which is more and more the lab-based techniques, and corporate-based breeding, which is the commercial breeding sector. Yes? Next one. And all of these 4 positions, and of course, all the combinations, have their strengths and their weaknesses. And actually, you would like to combine the strengths of all those 4 approaches, and you would like more interaction and synergy. Yes, next one. But we have noticed that that won't happen by itself. Most luckily, you can have 2-way or 3-way interactions, but you will not have 4-way interactions just by itself, not to a large extent at least. You need a 5th driver, a 5th orientation, the orientation that is very explicitly systems-based and focused on the system. And when I say system, I mean civil society, policy, nature, agriculture, the value chains, markets, all interrelated and mutually dependent components of the entire sector system. Yes? And ultimately, we defined 6 goals, 3 that cover more or less the societal resilience, social justice, food security, food quality and safety, and food and seed sovereignty, and 3 on the ecological side, agrobiodiversity, ecosystem services, and climate robustness. Yes? And I give a few examples of the challenges we still have. What was published in a French paper on faba bean was that by enlarging the harvest, the yield, the flower has also the shape of the flower has enlarged, and pollinators cannot reach the pollen any longer. And the same happened with red clover. My colleagues at the Louis Bock Institute had experienced that some clover varieties are not accessible for and especially the tetraploid varieties are not accessible enough for the pollinators and are very bad in seed production. But still they are sold because they are so much wanted by farmers, and seed producers simply make the seed 3 times as expensive, and there seems to be a market for that. But actually you can say, how ethical is that? Because we need pollination, also in our food crops. Yes, next one. And there are other ecosystem services that we have to pay attention to. And that is the soil-related traits for nutrient recycling, soil conservation, water provision, carbon sequestration. And that means that we need varieties with more root systems. But the fear with breeders is that it will go at the cost of the above soil biomass. And my colleagues have tested that with grasses, and they have seen that indeed, for some varieties that holds, but for other varieties, they can keep up the level of above ground biomass and still have a large enlarged root mass that leaves a lot of organic matter in the crop rotation and are for that purpose very much desired. Yes, next one. But there are also other approaches to deal with biodiversity, for instance, using heterogeneous material, crop mixtures. And the nice thing is that from this January onwards, there are new organic regulations in Europe, and they allow explicitly heterogeneous material and that doesn't have to pass the normal VCU testing, for instance. So that opens up a whole new type of varieties where diversity, genetic diversity can be exploited. Yes, next one. And now I want to give some examples where we have challenges on the societal level, corporate social responsibility, circular economy, etc. And a nice example is from the US, what I have heard from Frank Morton, the lettuce breeder, collaborating with High Mowing as a seed company. And the varieties of Frank Morton, the lettuce varieties, are taken up in the catalog of High Mowing. And they approached Frank saying, we appreciate your variety so much. We want to give you 10% of the turnover of those varieties that we sell through High Mowing. And Frank was actually very surprised. He said, but my varieties are free. There are no breeders' rights, so you don't have to pay me. But High Mowing argued, by acknowledging your efforts and by building up a relationship with you and by giving part of the financial turnover, we can build a relationship and we can ask you to cover some areas that are not yet covered by your varieties, but where their customers are asking for. And it saves them from having a lettuce breeding program, for instance. So what we see in the systems-based breeding is a required change in attitude towards collaboration and not considering each other as competitors. The next example. This is a Dutch example where I was involved with, where we have been working on, and still are, on late blight resistance in potato. And after a certain period, after 10 years, we were starting to release the first resistant varieties, and the partnering companies had also speed up their program and were entering the market with resistant varieties. But we saw is that the supermarkets said, why the heck are there new varieties? What's wrong with the old ones? And we want to stick to the old varieties because that is what the consumers are asking. And we had to learn them and bring them into the field to say, yeah, but these varieties are not resistant and are a huge risk for the farmers. And And then they saw the point and they agreed to go into transition because, of course, we didn't have enough seed potato available to cover the whole organic sector in 1 year, to take a transition period of 3 years, so that at the end of the 3 years, and that was 2020, all the supermarkets in the Netherlands would only sell potatoes, of the robust potatoes, they call it resistant, late blight resistant potatoes, for the organic segment. And we reached that goal for the fresh consumed potatoes, table varieties, but not yet for the processed potatoes. So that's still an ongoing challenge. Yes, and the next example. Another example, for instance, is who owns the discussion of who owns the seeds, but also who owns the seed company. And I thought the Johnny selected seeds, when the couple who started Johnny selected seeds, when they were ready to retire, they reorganized their company and made all the employees owners, co-owners, so that it couldn't be taken over by Monsanto or whoever would be interested without the consent of all the employees. And I think that's also a very interesting model. Yes, next one. And then a last Dutch example of the Beerse Hoeve. One of the health food store chain is Odin, and they have some 30 shops across the Netherlands by now. They acknowledged the fact that breeding is urgently needed for the organic sector, and they bought a farm for breeders, organic breeders, so that they don't have the pressure of the costs of the soil, which is terribly expensive in the Netherlands, and that they could continue also in the future for breeding. And I think that's a huge acknowledgement that a value chain embraces the breeders. Yes, last slide. So what I think is a challenge, that system-based breeding concept was designed not specifically for the organic sector, but I think the organic sector could very well embrace it. And I think the challenge is, especially for the organic sector, is how can we find ways, and I gave some examples of organizing and financing plant breeding, and how to involve value chain partners, how to involve consumers and the public in the breeding issue, how to create a balance between public and private interest in plant breeding, and how to create balance in public and private financial support for plant breeding. Actually, it means how can we find ways to make plant breeders part of our food communities, and not just suppliers of input, but a substantial partners in our food communities. Thank you. The last slide contains 2 papers, one on the techniques and one on the system-based breeding concept. Yes, thank you, Michelle. I hope this gives some input for the discussion.
Wonderful, thank you all. We've got several of the papers were shared, and we can add a link to Ben's paper too, and then they'll all, I think he showed his, the people who are here or watch it later can find those. It's wonderful homework. Many exciting concepts that you all shared, and as a package, it's very stimulating, I can say for me. I want to open up the floor to questions for folks, and just go ahead and, I would say, open your mic or raise your hand. Does anyone have questions for the panel? I can also try to read in the chat here. And I can't walk and chew gum. Maybe I'll ask a question and then I'll read and come back. You know, something that I see, I think that the summary concept about public-private partnerships is very much in the air, and the amount of money that is in the private sector is, you know, I think moving things very rapidly. I think, and we see a lot of engagement across. I liked your spheres. You know, I think several of these spheres were having interactions between one or two or three, but I think to actually have the longevity we need to do reading over the long term for societal values, I don't know how and where that would be positioned. I guess maybe people can speak to that. I think that currently the costs for organic breeding, even as it is, are much higher than for conventional. So I don't know, I think all three of you might have something to say. And I hope Ben has joined us by now to answer questions, but Edith, maybe we want to take this in reverse order.
I don't know if organic breeding costs are higher than conventional. Is that what you suggested, Michelle? Did I understand that correctly?
At least in for maize, we really heard that, you know, that production of seed with no chemical controls to make a hybrid, for example, is very difficult. I mean, I think certainly for some vegetable systems, like Frank Morton's, maybe his are not more expensive. I mean, certainly people are making it happen in the vegetable sector, but for corn, and maybe the hybrid situation is one that, you know, we were following in our project. And so it seemed like the people who really were breeding and making that hybrid under organic conditions, their costs were I forget, was almost twice as high. And so they were really subsidizing organic and the availability of seed grown without pesticides, but making that, I mean, without fungal treatments, but not on organically certified fields, was a lot cheaper, right?
Yeah. That is also for many breeders a reason to go for open pollinated varieties in those crops where the hybridization has been very much advanced. And then certainly breeding for open pollinated varieties can be less expensive than for hybrids. That's true, I think. But markers selected, as was presented by Ben, marker-assisted selection can still be a good tool to advance breeding, certainly for complex traits. I have, for instance, in my potato breeding program, we had to use markers because you can't see in the field by the looks of the plant if it is resistant due to 1, 2, or 3 genes. And if you want to stack resistant, those major genes to prevent rapid breakdown, yeah, you want to combine 2 or 3 resistant genes, and you can only trace them if you have markers for that. And as Benjamin said, but I think also Susanna and Sara pointed out that that is used for, markers are used for genetic analysis and not for gene modification. So that is allowed in organic sector.
So the tension over breeding for ecosystem services and making, sharing with other goods versus this extraction, and I think Ben's point about not only increasing the percent of the pie that corporations take, but also increasing the size of the pie. right? I think it was an interesting point that he was making. And I think that that tension or that notion in terms of optimizing resource care, you know, and I think that those organic principles, and I liked, I think Susanna and Sarah's closing about, you know, this articulation of systems-based breeding for societal goods or for organic values gives us a positive direction, right? And then can be easily understood by people why something like marker-assisted selection is helping towards pursue those goals and not being an excessive taking, if you will, right? But I'm curious because I think you went right to where we sort of know that we need to figure out how to partner in different ways, but other than these kind of pant leg, you know, so are we going to always, this is going to succeed at a smaller scale, or, you know, how is this really done? Is it through, you know, the value of the organic framing? You know, in the US, there was I think some people are feeling that organic is under a lot of threat, and maybe its values aren't appreciated.
I don't know that I have the answers to these questions, but I can offer a few thoughts, especially like, yeah, in relation to what you were just speaking about, but this will seem like it's going back, but I'll bring it back around. I was at a different session earlier today put on by the Organic Center, the Organic Confluences Summit, focusing on agricultural technologies. And a great speaker opened us up for the day, Dr. Samir Doshi, and he was talking about technologies and just how, drawing from someone else's work who I don't remember the name of, technologies are really amplifiers. And so if you're putting them into a space that already has inequities and power imbalances, they're likely to amplify those unless you work very diligently to utilize them otherwise. And I think that really relates to what Sara and I found when speaking with the organic community about gene editing technologies. And then I think that relates to some of the examples that Edith was bringing up about these ways that, you know, different organizations, people, companies have, you know, very intentionally flipped the incentives or changed the organizational structures to operate differently. And that is where those organic values can really come to fruition. And then, yeah, from my own research, comparing organic sector governance in the US and Canada and Mexico, they operate very differently. And I think that's, you know, the conversation in the US around like the Real Organic Project and these sort of beyond organic, like there really is a space emerging there for a reason. And I don't want to take us down a tangent, but that's certainly what I've seen. And then the other thing I would just say is, as I am not an expert in plant breeding, there's another great paper that I'm going to share by my colleagues and our co-author, Alex Lyon and Hannah Whitman, and the amazing Harriet Friedman, about the role that universities have to play in seed sovereignty. So just in terms of public-private partnerships, maybe there are some insights there. So that's all I'll say.
Yeah, we managed to get a public-private partnership in a project, in that particular potato breeding project that I was involved in, and we got a 10-year grant. And that was until 2020, and we have now got another 10-year grant from the government to continue, because we are very much focusing on 10 different wild relatives of potato to exploit new genes, resistance genes, and make them available for the large, not only the large, but the middle and the smaller breeding companies. And those companies are partners in the project and are contributing in kind and doing part of the selection. But we also have the system of participatory plant breeding it still exists in the Netherlands. Even in conventional potato breeding, we have 150 farmer breeders still involved with the big companies to do part of the selection. And that allows, and they do it for a no cure, no pay, on a no cure, no pay basis, which makes it very much profitable for the potato sector to keep a very broad assortment of varieties that are adapted to different climate zones in the Netherlands and different soil types, etc. And that participatory effort, farmer breeders joining the larger breeding companies or smaller breeding companies is quite unique, and it still exists. And in the organic potato breeding program, we organized courses for organic potato growers to join the breeding program and to get interested and to collaborate to make breeding feasible for the organic sector, which is only a small segment of the total agricultural sector in the Netherlands. So yeah, there are still ways new ways to make it also financial feasible. Or the other example that even a value chain has incorporated a breeding farm and company so that, and taken over the costs so that, breeding for the future for this sector is guaranteed. And of course, that is, includes 2 breeders, so they can do a few crops, not the whole assortment, of course. So we need more of those initiatives. And I'm not so very much afraid that the organic sector is at threat by reframing, but it's clear that we have a lot of homework to do, and we can't lean back and pray that all of a sudden there will be a bag of new varieties that fit our sector. We really have to get at work, and that's what we did with the potato breeding program. Initiated courses for farmers to get interested, to get knowledge on how to incorporate the selection in their farming system.
It's a wonderful example, and sort of as a positive case study, it would be nice to, put that out there to inspire other efforts. We have a question from Bo K, and I'm sorry, that's what I think that was the name on the chat, where they're asking, are efforts to legislate financial compensation for organic growers affected by GM cross-pollination a step in the wrong direction, given people's propensity to seek simple solutions?
I don't know if I quite understand.
Yeah, maybe I don't know whether Bo wants to clarify. Maybe it's that if people are compensated, they wouldn't be as concerned about cross-pollination, and maybe that removes the desire to breed for prevention. I don't know, maybe Sara or Susanna, maybe Sara thinks about this more.
Yeah, I'm also having a bit of a hard time understanding whether that's a reference to specific attempts to legislate, specific legislations, or a little extra clarity would be great.
And I don't know if the compensation is really active, but it's difficult because in Europe, GMOs are still not allowed. So we don't have that cross-pollination, only in Spain to a certain extent with corn. In the Netherlands, we've had quite a long discussion with the government and the conventional sector that one of the conditions to allow GMOs would be a fund to compensate when cross-pollination occurs. And the organic sector said, yeah, but we're not going to pay for that. That the polluters should pay. And in the end, and they of course didn't agree. So the compromise was, I think that it would be 50-50 contribution, but that fund is still empty. So that was a nice idea, but it's not working. So I don't see the compensation really working, but I can only speak from Europe, and it's not effective there yet.
I guess in the sort of, for Bo's question, I appreciate this, inducing people to actually take on and invest in breeding for larger wants, right? So not just yield and not just cheap food, to really actually breed so that we could track or benefit pollinators and protect from soil erosion, so really to afford to actually document that for people so that the consumer is willing to pay for that greater good, to pay more, the premium for that seed, or actually when they buy organic, it's not just this sort of nebulous purity. It really is knowing that they are paying and helping support ecosystem integrity, right? I mean, how do we do that? And I do think that some of the papers listed sort of talk about that a little bit, but ideas about how we really do that, or examples where people have done that beyond the market. I think, Edith, you did a great job of showing how we're starting to address those larger structural economic inequities.
Mm. And that is indeed a big question. How can we raise more awareness among the public? And yes, there are small examples. Odin, that value chain of organic health food stores, they supported, they included their clients, the consumers, the buyers, to help taste 2 new breads from different new organically bred varieties. And they, in advance, they could pay for it. And then in the autumn, when after the harvest and the bread baker had baked the breads, they could contribute by evaluating the taste, the consistency, etc. And they made the consumers have a say in which variety would eventually be used for the bread in that shop. So Odin is a cooperative of consumers. So they really do a positive effort of including the clients in tasting sessions and helping to decide which variety taste is the best and is wanted in the shops. And of course, it's a small scale. It's only 25 shops and is only a percentage. But I think we have to start small to see what, if we want to include consumers, what do we have to do? What kind of obstacles do we come across, and how can we solve it before we enlarge the initiative?
Martin, did you want to ask a question? I think your mic is off.
No, I don't want to. I'm thinking about, a lot of questions came up when I heard Edith and Susanna and Sara talking about, technology, that it is, fair game in organic. And then I was, thinking about the potatoes. I think that's a great project, but it's, it's like our project where we have the universities trying to, get things going because, at the private sector, things are so small scale that, breeders do not have access to technology, to all the things that they need in order to, improve crops. But sometimes I think, what do we need to do? How do we enable these private organic breeders to get access to technology, to get access to germplasm, to get to really make an impact in the whole business. When I think, and potatoes, all the examples that we heard about, the lettuce, the potatoes, these are directly going to consumers. They can directly make a decision. These are the things that I want to spend more money on. There are these little, networks where, consumers directly test and make selections and can contribute. But what about the farmer here in the Midwest who creates an organic row crop where the seed goes into the animal, into feeding animals, and that are then, where's the, there's the consumer is far removed from this. The premiums aren't that high. There are a lot of pressures on the farm to, to figure out the economics to make it all work. And I'm rambling here, but I think the whole thing is very complicated and complex. And at the beginning, we have the breeders that, have a hard time to capture revenue in order to really, push fantastic varieties into the market that can actually, help the farmers, help the consumers, and
So I think we have to wrap up now, and that your complex rambling encompasses the real complexity. So our speakers, I think, did a great job. Want to thank them very much, our panelists, for helping us think about the bigger values-driven assumptions and directions that systems-based reading might bring us to. And it will be, as Martin's anticipating, how do breeders get connected up with what the consumers and pro-social citizens want. So thanks very much.